Yes, sir.
Okay.
No, sir, I came home.
Okay, all right. So we will be talking about um, Coleridge and his poem Kubla Khan today. Um, Now, before we start really talking about uh, the poem, let me point out a few things. Kubla Khan was written sometime around 1797, 1798, late 1797 or early 1798. But it was only published in 1816, and it was published along with two other poems, Christabel and The Pains of Sleep, in 1816. So please note this, that although Kubla Khan was written in 1797, 1798, it was published along with two other poems, Christabel and The Pains of Sleeps, in 1816. So it was published almost 2 decades, 18 years later after its composition. Um, if you look at the preface of the poem comes with a preface. The prefatory remark by the poet gives us certain important information and also acts as a choric commentary, giving us a peep into the circumstances in which the poem was written, the poem was composed. According to Coleridge, he had composed around 54 lines while he was under the influence of laudanum, which is a form of opium. Coleridge was an opium addict. You know, they would mix country liquor and opium and then drink it. It was also it also act as a sedative. And in the preface, he writes that he was under the influence of opium and he had actually dreamt several hundred lines about Kubla Khan. When he woke up, he was putting them down. He was merely writing the poem as he had experienced it in his dream. And as he was writing down the poem, he was called on by a visitor from Porlock. He went out, received the man, and had a conversation for some time. When he came back, he could not remember what the exact details of his dreams. He had forgotten a large chunk of his dream. And therefore, it is the preface which says that Kubla Khan is an incomplete poem. That Kubla Khan is a poetic fragment. In fact, the subtitle of the poem is a fragment or a vision in a dream. So it is the preface and the subtitle which actually comments on the occasion of the composition and on the nature of its incompleteness. Now, there are critics who have suggested that Coleridge, the poet who wrote Kubla Khan, and Coleridge, the critic who wrote the preface, are not to be considered as one entity. The critic who wrote the preface was actually adding a critical marginalia to the poem, was giving a cue to the readers how to read the poem, but the readers are free to decide whether they should read the poem as Coleridge, the critic, wants them to read. So the readers are free to decide whether they should read the poem as a poetic fragment or a poetic commentary on the nature of romantic imagination. Is not completeness, incompleteness, is not a degree of inconclusiveness of the very condition of romantic imagination. So that is what we are going to engage with. That is what we are going to try and understand in this poem. That is incompleteness, is inconclusivity, an essential component of romantic imagination. If it is so, then it is rather natural that a romantic poem would be incomplete, that the basic ingredient, that the basic attribute of a romantic poem would be its incompleteness. Then is it wise to read or brand this poem as a poetic fragment, as a patchwork brilliance, as something that is inherently inconclusive? Now, if romantic imagination is inherently inconclusive, then there is no point in reading the poem as a poetic fragment, as something that is not complete in itself. Now, we will engage with this debate. Now, I is this bit clear what I'm trying to say?
Yes, sir.
Okay. সবাই সবার কাছে ক্লিয়ার তো, অর্ঘ অ্যান্ড আদার্স?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Very good.
Now, I just pointed out to you that Rajashri, please mute yourself. I just pointed out to you that Kubla Khan was published with two other poems. And Coleridge, in the preface to the poem, makes it clear that he had dreamed the entire poem. He was under the influence of laudanum, opium, and he had dreamed this entire poem. So the poem is to be seen as a dream vision. And look at how, in The Pains of Sleep, Coleridge talks about the nature of sleep. The poem is called Pains of Sleep. Sleep is supposed to restore you. Sleep is always celebrated in literature as having a restorative power, one that rejuvenates your body, your mind, one that is restorative, one that has healing properties. But Coleridge talks about the pains of sleep, the sufferings of sleep, the anxieties of sleep. And please keep in mind, this is not a sleep that takes place spontaneously. This is not a sleep that occurs naturally. This is rather a sleep induced by opium. It is almost a medically induced sleep. This is not a sleep that takes place spontaneously, that comes to you naturally. This is the second stanza of the poem, The Pains of Sleep. But yesternight I prayed aloud in anguish and in agony, upstarting from the fiendish crowd of shapes and thoughts that tortured me, a lurid light, a trampling throng, sense of intolerable wrong. And whom I scorned, those only strong, thirst of revenge, the powerless will, still baffled and yet burning still, desire with loathing strangely mixed, on wild or hateful objects fixed, fantastic passions maddening brawl, and shame and terror over all. So he's experiencing shame, he's experiencing terror, he's experiencing anguish. Deeds to be hid which were not hid, which all confused I could not know whether I suffered or I did, for all seemed guilt, remorse, or woe, my own or others still the same, life stifling fear, soul stifling shame. So he is plagued by a sense of fear, by an overwhelming sense of fear and shame. So 2 nights passed, the night's dismay saddened and stunned the coming day. Sleep, the wide blessing, seemed to me distemper's worst calamity. Sleep, which is a blessing. Sleep that allows you to rejuvenate your body, soul, and mind. Sleep that is celebrated for its healing and restorative power is not an occasion that is celebrated in this poem. It is rather seen, it is rather described as the worst calamity. The third night, so he could not sleep for 2 nights. He is afraid. And sleep appears to him as if as a calamity. The third night, when my own loud scream had waked me from my fiendish dream. So why he can't sleep? Because he's tortured by nightmares. And the sleep is supposed to restore you, to replenish your potential. But sleep here plagues him, tortures him. Sleep comes with a deep sense of shame, with a deep sense, with an overwhelming sense of fear. Sleep is stifling his soul, killing his potential. He is afraid of sleep. Why? Because he's tortured by nightmarish images, by fiendish dreams. Overcome with sufferings, strange and wild, I wept. I had been a child, and having thus my tears subdued, my anguish to a milder mood, such punishment I said were due to natures deeply stained with sin. So, on the one hand, he's afraid of sleep. On the one hand, he's plagued by nightmares. On the one hand, he wakes up screaming in the middle of the sleep because he's plagued by fiendish dreams. And then he wakes up suffering, anguished. He realizes that he deserves all this. He realizes that he is deeply stained with sin, and therefore the restorative touch of sleep has abandoned him. So this is the kind of troubled relationship that Coleridge has with sleep, because this sleep is induced. This is not a natural culmination of a tiresome day. This is not a natural inclination to rest, to heal oneself. It is rather induced. It is rather an aftermath of medication. It numbs you but does not give you adequate rest. So this is how he talks about sleep. Please keep this in mind. Please underline this. Now, we will turn to one of the greatest books on romantic poetry, which was published in 1817 by Coleridge, called Biographia Literaria. Now, this book is important because in this book, Coleridge extensively talks about his philosophy of poetry, his poetics, and how his philosophy of poetry, his idea of poetry, is significantly different from that of Wordsworth. From chapters 4 to 13 in the Biographia Literaria, Coleridge talks about his intellectual development as a writer. He talks about the influence of various German philosophers on him. He talks about the influence of Immanuel Kant on his understanding and poetic development. He also talks about the influence of Schiller and Schlegel. They're all German philosophers, and how their ideas have shaped Coleridge's understanding of poetry, particularly his understanding of imagination. Then Coleridge in goes on to talk about his understanding of imagination. And while he talks about his idea of imagination, he underlines that imagination is an heterogeneous concept. It is made up of three essential components. Now, if you're talking about imagination, imagination is of various types. It's a heterogeneous concept. It's a medley of concepts bunched together. And since imagination is key to romantic poetry, we must engage with various components of imagination. And then he names the three components, which he calls fancy, primary imagination, and secondary imagination. Now, there are critics who have pointed out that Kubla Khan is actually a poetic explication, a poetic rendering of Coleridge's understanding of imagination in its three components, namely fancy, primary imagination, and secondary imagination. Now, it is important to note that in chapter 13 of Biographia Literaria, the chapter type 13 is entitled On the Imagination or Exemplistic Power. On the imagination or exemplistic power. Now, what does Coleridge mean by exemplistic power? The exemplistic power is an essential attribute of imagination. It is one of the defining features of imagination. It is the potential of the imagination, the ability of imagination to shape diverse, disparate elements that we perceive from reality into an unified and concurrent whole. It is the potential of the mind to harmonize experiences, disparate experiences, ideas, and even opposites, you know, contradictory ideas, opposing notions into a poetic creation. So, a simplistic capacity of imagination is a potential that imposes an aesthetic coherence, is the capacity of the imagination to create a poetic coherence, a poetic unification of disparate elements. It actually means to give shape to. A simplistic means to give a kind of shape to a medley, to a diverse medley of perceptions. It is therefore to be regarded as an unifying function, as an unifying attribute of imagination. This attribute of imagination is also essential in order to harmonize the opposites, in order to strike a balance, a poise between opposing and contradictory perceptions, emotions. And we will see how how Coleridge engages with these ideas, poetically explicates them in Kubla Khan. Now, let us look at chapter 13 and try and understand how Coleridge defines primary imagination, secondary imagination, and fancy. Now, this is page number 159 of Biographia Literaria. You will find Biographia Literaria in archive.org. The e-text is available. Page number 159, and this is Coleridge. I'm quoting from him. The imagination then I consider either as primary or secondary. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power. Please take note. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power or prime agent of all human perception. And as a repetition in the infinite mind of the eternal act of creation, and as a repetition in the finite mind mane human mind, of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Now, it must be noted that this definition of primary imagination clearly echoes the words of the Exodus, the biblical allusion in this definition is palpable. It clearly echoes the words of the Exodus. When God reveals himself in the burning bush to Moses, Moses asks who he is. Moses is confused, and God replies, and I quote, I am that I am. This is a direct reference to the biblical story of the self revelation of God, where Moses realizes his calling to lead the suffering Israelites from away from Egypt. I am that I am. And this I am is a reference, is a direct reference to that. So, Coleridge defines primary imagination as the human capacity to see, the human capacity to perceive. But perceive what? The human capacity to perceive the world that God has created, that a divine energy has created. Look at this. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception. So we perceive things because we are endowed with the potential of primary imagination. But what are we perceiving? We are perceiving the realities, the world as we encounter. But keep this in mind that this perception is merely a repetition of the original act of creation that only God is capable of indulging in. I hope you're aware of the story of creation in Genesis, the biblical story of creation. So we are only perceiving the world and the reality only because the original act of divine creation has taken place. We perceive the world, and this perception is nothing but a repetition, and it takes place in the finite mind. What is a finite mind? The human mind is a finite mind. And what is the infinite I am? It is actually an attempt to define God. I am that I am. I am infinite. The secondary imagination, coming back to Coleridge's text, I consider as an echo of the former, coexisting with the conscious will, yet as identical with the primary in the kind of its agency, differing only in degree and in the mode of operation. The secondary imagination is almost analogous to the primary imagination. However, the secondary imagination only differs in the degree and the mode of operation. Otherwise, it is almost analogous to the primary imagination. Now, how does where does secondary imagination differ from primary imagination? The secondary imagination differs only in its mode of operation. Now, how does it work? It dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to create. Where this process is rendered impossible, yet still at all events it struggles to idealize and to unify. So the assemblastic potential of imagination actually takes place within the domain of secondary imagination, because the secondary imagination is the unifying, epitomizes the unifying potential of imagination. It is only through the exercise of secondary imagination that you can impose an aesthetic order, that you can impose a poetic unity on the differing, on the disparate elements of perception that you have perceived through primary imagination. Now, please keep in mind that this understanding of primary imagination and secondary imagination is essentially Christian. Coleridge goes on to say, it is essentially vital, even as all objects are essentially fixed and dead. It is the primary imagination that induces the vitality in the otherwise dead perceptions that we receive through primary imagination. So, what we perceive through primary imagination, what is actually a repetition of the divine act of creation, is revitalized, is given an aesthetic form and unity through secondary imagination. So, the secondary imagination actually has a revitalizing potential. The secondary imagination is actually the domain where the assemblastic potential of imagination is exercised. Am I making sense?
Yes, sir.
Boys, is this clear, all of you?
Yes, sir.
So, did you understand the essential difference between primary imagination and secondary imagination? Because it is this, this is a theoretical key to understanding Kubla Khan. Now, so please keep this in mind that I am basically referring to two ideas. One is how Kubla Khan was grouped together with two other poems, one of which talked about the pains and the anguish of sleep, a sleep that is medically induced, a sleep that is bereft of its restorative and healing potential, a sleep that pains. Please remember that the story, now Kubla Khan is a story within a story. What is the framing narrative? The framing narrative is that Coleridge, under the influence of laudanum, had actually dreamt it. He was disturbed, or he was called on by a traveler from Porlock. He went to attend him, and then when he came back, he could not recollect the entire poem. And it is this disjunction. It is because of the presence of the traveler that there was a disjunction, that there was a break, that there was a disruption that was created in an otherwise complete poem. Because when he came back, he could not recall the poem. He merely took down the lines that he could recall. And then within the poem, we come across the story of Kubla Khan, the great conqueror, and the poet. And both of them try to build a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. Now, please keep in mind, while I was repeatedly talking about the assemblastic potential of imagination, about the capacity of imagination to impose an aesthetic order on an otherwise diverse set of perceptions, I had also talked about its potential to strike a poise or balance between contradictory ideas. And Kubla Khan is strewn with contradictory ideas. You have a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. A sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. We generally do not associate ice and sunlight together. But it is because of the assemblastic potential of imagination that we could accommodate these two contradictory ideas together within the text of the poem. We would also talk about ancestral voices professing war. Kubla, and amidst the tumult, Kubla heard from far ancestral voices professing war. Kubla Khan was in a pleasure dome. Kubla Khan, in an otherwise placid and peaceful landscape, Kubla suddenly hears ancestral voices professing war. Again, contradictory ideas are bundled together. And what gives the text this capacity to talk about contradictory ideas? The assemblastic potential of imagination, which accommodates or strikes a balance between otherwise contradictory set of ideas. And it is because of this potential that contradictory sets of ideas could be accommodated without disrupting an aesthetic wholeness, without disrupting a sense of aesthetic order, without disrupting a poetic unity of the text. Right? Is this clear? All of you, Noyon, Shubham, is this clear?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Now, so this is chapter 13, where he talks about the asymplastic potential of imagination. He has talked about primary imagination, he's also talked about secondary imagination. But what is fancy? Fancy, on the contrary, this is Coleridge, has no other counters to play with but fixities and definites. The fancy is indeed no other than a mode of memory emancipated from the order of time and space, while it is blended with and modified by that empirical phenomenon of the will which we express by the word choice. But equally, with the ordinary memory, the fancy must receive all materials ready-made from the law of association. So Coleridge associates fancy with a kind of an aggregative potential of the mind. Fancy is the potential of imagination which merely accumulates data. It does not have the potential to undergo permutations and combinations of this data and to enliven them, to revitalize them into poetic experiences. It merely aggregates data. It deals with fixities. You see a river, it is because of fancy that you perceive a river. So it is mechanical. It is physiological in function. It does not have a creative potential. So we are basically looking at a hierarchy of perception. First you have fancy, then you have primary imagination, and then you have secondary imagination. And what is the highest conceivable state of imagination according to Coleridge? It is the operation or the exercise of secondary imagination. Right? You create aesthetic experiences, you create an aesthetic order, you create a poetic unity because of the revitalizing and enlivening potential of secondary imagination. Now, we will briefly look at chapter 14. Where Coleridge talks about how the lyrical ballads was conceived. Chapter 14 is a very detailed critique of Wordsworth's conception of poetry. This chapter also underlines how Coleridge's conception of poetry substantially differs from Wordsworth's understanding of poetry. What is the qualitative difference between these two conceptions and schools of poetry? Please keep in mind that it was Wordsworth and Coleridge who came together to publish, it was a poetic collaboration to publish lyrical ballads. But that collaboration did not last long, they fell apart. And now Coleridge is trying to investigate the reasons for that fallout. The fallout was intellectual. They did not fight. How did Wordsworth and Coleridge's conception of poetry substantially differ from each other? And it the occasion for the controversy was when Coleridge published the preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, which was published in 1800. The first edition of Lyrical Ballads was published in 1798, to which Coleridge contributed only 4 poems. It had, I think, 23 poems. Coleridge only contributed 4 poems. And the remaining 19 were contributed by Wordsworth. So it was overwhelmingly his anthology, Wordsworth's anthology. In the second edition, which is published in 1800, Wordsworth added an extended introduction. And that introduction, or that preface to the volume of poems, actually created an intellectual difference between the two poets. Because Coleridge did not subscribe to the theoretical notions that Wordsworth was associating to this new school of poetry. Let me read out a section from this. During the first year, this is chapter 14, that Mr. Wordsworth and I were neighbors, our conversations turned frequently on 2 cardinal points of poetry: the power of exciting the sympathy of the reader by a faithful adherence to the truth of nature, and the power of giving the interest of novelty by the modifying colors of imagination. So Coleridge is basically talking about primary imagination and secondary imagination. You see? So Wordsworth and Coleridge, while they were poetic collaborators, basically talked about 2 important ideas of poetry, 2 important aspects of poetry. First, how you should faithfully represent the truth of nature, and how what was perceived as reality could be made new by the operation of imagination. Now, you are intelligent enough to understand that the first aspect of poetry, how to truthfully perceive the reality of nature, is actually an exercise of primary imagination. It is a repetition within the finite mind of the infinite I am. And the infinite I am is present in the diversity of nature. And you are basically faithfully repeating this diversity through the exercise of primary imagination. The secondary imagination will make this exercise new. The secondary imagination, through its creative potential of permutation and combination, will be able to create something new out of this perception. So he is basically talking about 2 potentials of poetry. One is primary imagination. The second is secondary imagination. But please keep in mind that primary imagination must precede secondary imagination. You have to first faithfully perceive the reality of nature, and only then can the creative potential of imagination operate on these perceptions, create new permutations and combinations, and impose an aesthetic order, a poetic unity on the otherwise diverse perceptions of reality. Right? Is this all right? Am I making sense?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
The thought suggested itself that a series of poems must be composed of 2 sorts. So as they were discussing the scope of compiling a book of poems based on these 2 operations of imagination, they thought that 2 kinds of poems should be written. In the one, the incidents and agents were to be, in part at least, supernatural. In one aspect, there will be a section of poems that will deal with the supernatural elements. And we all know Coleridge would deal with this. Think of Kubla Khan. It talks about a metaphysical encounter, how a band of mariners who were rescued by an albatross suddenly shot the albatross to death. And all the other mariners perished, only the captain survived. And he had an immense sense of guilt. The albatross was hanging round his neck. Or think of Christabel, who has a supernatural encounter with Geraldine. Christabel, which is an uncanny amalgam of Christ and Abel. Abel was the first man to be murdered. Cain murdered Abel because God accepted Abel's offering before Cain's offering. And therefore, in a fit of jealousy, Cain murdered his younger brother Abel. And Christabel, the name Christabel, is made up of an amalgamation of Christ and Abel. And she encounters Geraldine in the absence of her husband, in the absence of her lover. And she's not aware of the nature of this encounter. What sort of an encounter is this? When she gets up in the morning, she feels a strange sense of fear and shame. But she's unaware. She's not sure about the details of the encounter, but the aftermath of the encounter is terrifying. So look at these supernatural elements. Look at this, the encounters of the experiences that Coleridge talks about in his poems are not quotidian, are not everyday experiences of human transaction. And the second, the excellence aimed at was to consist in the interesting of the affections by the dramatic truth of such emotions as would naturally accompany such situations, supposing them real. And real in this sense they have been to every human being who, from whatever source of delusion, has at any time believed himself under supernatural agency. For the second class, subjects were to be chosen from ordinary life. So the second group of poems would consist of characters who would come from the daily intercourse of human life. The characters and incidents were to be such as will be found in every village and its vicinity, where there is a meditative and feeling mind to seek after them or to notice them when they present themselves. Now, the first group of poems would talk about supernatural encounters, about supernatural elements, which is not very common, but with which we sometimes have an uncanny encounter. Everything in life is not explicable. Sometimes things are beyond human comprehension, and they are also a part of life, not very dominant, but certainly a part of life. And Coleridge was much more interested in those supernatural encounters, in those metaphysical experiences. Whereas Wordsworth was to compose a group of poems that could talk about the drudgeries of daily life, that could talk about, about common men, that could talk about the dominant experiences of life, would talk about men coming from various walks of life, men that we would encounter in every village, experiences that are quotidian, that are very quotidian, that are part of our everyday life and intercourse. Right? Ajke ei obdi thak, because I'm certain you have a class after this. So this is the theoretical framework. This is the theoretical key to unlocking the kind of poetry that we would encounter in Kubla Khan. Can we organize one more class so that we can talk about the text? কালকে কি সন্ধ্যেবেলা একটা ক্লাস করা যায়? কারণ তোমরা কালকে বাইটারি ফিরবে, হয়তো আজকে সকালবেলাটা ব্যস্ত থাকবে, নাকি সকালে? ঠিক সকালে করো, নো প্রবলেম, সকালে করো। তাহলে একটা কাজ করো, কালকে 12টা থেকে করো ক্লাসটা। কালকে 12টা থেকে করো। সবার কারোর আপত্তি নেই তো? কালকে 12টা থেকে আমি 1 ঘন্টাই নেব, 1 ঘন্টা 10-15 মিনিট। I will deal with the
Okay, sir. Okay.
Fine. So we will meet tomorrow at 12 for 1 hour 15 minutes, and we will discuss Kubla Khan. Is this all right with all of you?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for organizing these classes. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
ए बोका ठीक बड़ा ए ओए बड़ा ए ओए
Mukeniene, 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 mukeniene.
It's not in the Bible. Did you consider that? Hey, wow. Yes, sir.